An injured veteran and his service dog were thrown onto the streets in the middle of a stormy night. Homeless and penniless, their only hope lay in the will of a father who had been missing for 20 years. But when they arrived, Jack stood frozen. What awaited them wasn't a home, but a desolate outpost dangling over a deadly abyss. Why would a father leave such a dangerous gift to his disabled son? And what terrifying secret lies hidden beneath the ice of the Dead Wind Gap? Just when everyone thought it was a dead end, Buster discovered something deep in the gorge that would change the fate of the entire town. What happens next will truly touch your heart. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The city was a jagged landscape of iron and oil, drowning under a persistent freezing rain that smelled of industrial rot. Gray clouds hung low, heavy with the soot of 1,000 chimneys, turning the daylight into a dim, suffocating twilight. It was a day meant for endings, cold and devoid of mercy. Jack stood at the edge of the grease-stained workshop, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly as he gripped the handle of his worn metal toolbox. At 48, he carried the history of a combat engineer in the very architecture of his body, broad shoulders that had once hauled bridge spans under mortar fire, and a face etched with deep permanent furrows like dry riverbeds. His hair was a salt and pepper buzz cut, and his eyes, once the piercing blue of a clear sky, had faded into a weary, clouded slate. He shifted his weight, and a sharp, jagged ache flared in his left leg. It was a familiar ghost, a reminder of a roadside IED that had shattered his femur and his career in a single blinding flash of heat. Across from him stood Mr. Henderson, the shop owner, a portly man whose neck seemed to have retreated into his collar out of shame. Henderson was a creature of ledgers and bottom lines, his personality as sterile and cold as the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He sighed, the sound lost in the rhythmic drumming of rain on the corrugated tin roof, and muttered a rehearsed speech about insurance liabilities and the slowing economy. The truth remained unsaid, but felt like a physical blow. To Henderson, Jack was no longer a master of steel. He was just a piece of faulty equipment, a rusted bolt that no longer fit the machine. By Jack's side, Buster sat with a stillness that commanded the room. He was a sable German shepherd, a retired K9 who had survived the same desert dust as his master. His coat was a thick textured mosaic of tan and charcoal, scarred in places but kept impeccably clean. Buster's muzzle was beginning to show the silver frost of age, but his amber eyes remained sharp and predatory, constantly calculating the distance between Jack and any perceived threat. Sensing the sudden drop in Jack's spirit, the dog let out a low, grounding huff and leaned his heavy, warm shoulder against Jack's scarred leg, acting as a living brace. The dismissal was final. Jack didn't plead. A soldier knew when a position was overrun. He felt a hot surge of shame, not for being fired, but for the indignity of being deemed useless in a country he had helped protect. He whistled softly, a sound that carried a hidden weight of grief, and together they stepped out of the oily warmth of the shop and into the relentless downpour. The walk back to his tenement was a grueling exercise in silent endurance. Every step was a battle against the slick, uneven sidewalk, and the metallic tang of the rain felt like blood on his tongue. When he finally reached the cramped, peeling door of his apartment, he found his meager belongings already piled in the hallway, covered by a thin, translucent sheet of plastic that rattled in the draft. Mrs. Gable, the landlady, stood there with her arms crossed, her eyes narrow and cold. She was a spindly woman who smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap, cloying floral perfume. Her skin pulled so tight over high cheekbones that she resembled a predatory bird waiting for a carcass. She was a woman who had long ago traded her soul for the security of a steady rent check. Without a hint of empathy, she informed him in a voice like grinding gravel that a new tenant had offered double the rent in cash. Jack felt the old warrior's fury rise in his chest, a desire to roar at the injustice of it all. But the exhaustion was deeper, a bone-weary fatigue that silenced him. He was a builder of bridges, yet here he was, unable to secure a single room for himself and his dog. He spent the next hour loading his aging black pickup truck. The vehicle was a relic of a different era, its engine humming with a persistent rhythmic rattle, but it was the only thing Jack truly owned. Buster hopped into the passenger seat, his wet fur releasing a scent of damp earth and old leather, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. Jack returned to the pile of boxes one last time to grab a small, weathered wooden chest that had belonged to his mother. He sat on the tailgate for a long moment, the rain soaking through his jacket, and opened the lid with trembling fingers. Among the yellowed photographs of a life he barely remembered, and his own service medals, a crisp white envelope caught his eye. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably familiar. The script of a man he hadn't spoken to in 20 long, bitter years. His father had been a ghost in Jack's life, a man of blueprints, obsession, and silences who had walked out when Jack was just a boy. Jack had spent 2 decades cultivating a garden of resentment toward him, labeling him a mad scientist who cared more for the physics of wind than the well-being of his son. With a heavy heart, he tore open the envelope. The letter was brief, devoid of apologies, but vibrating with a strange, frantic urgency. It spoke of a place called the Watchtower, a property perched precariously on the granite peaks of the northern mountains. "It is yours now, Jack," the letter read, the ink smudged by time. "The world is changing, and the storms are coming. You were always a builder. You will need to be one again, for the sake of those who cannot build for themselves." A bitter, hollow laugh escaped Jack's throat, turning into a rough cough. A watchtower? He pictured a crumbling ruin, another burden left by a man who had only ever given him grief and abandonment. He looked at his scarred hands, then at the gray, indifferent city that had just spat him out like trash. The city was a slow death, a grinding machine that turned men into statistics. The mountains, however, offered a destination, a final mission. He realized then that he and his father were the same, 2 men discarded by a world that had no use for broken things or wild dreams. The Watchtower wasn't just an inheritance, it was a challenge from beyond the grave. He climbed into the driver's seat, the springs groaning under his weight. He looked at Buster, who rested his head on the dashboard, his amber eyes reflecting the flickering neon signs of the industrial district. The interior of the truck smelled of wet dog and old upholstery, a scent that felt more like home than any apartment ever had. Jack turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a defiant mechanical growl that echoed off the brick walls of the alley. He didn't look back at the tenement or the workshop. He shifted the truck into gear, his jaw set in a hard line of grim, military determination. He was leaving the ruins of his life behind, heading toward a ghost from his past, carrying nothing but a letter and a loyal hound. The road ahead was a dark ribbon winding into the unknown, disappearing into the mist of the high peaks. But for the first time in years, Jack felt the faint, flickering spark of a purpose. They were no longer just drifting, they were retreating to higher ground to prepare for the storm. The mountain peaks were jagged teeth biting into a lead-gray sky, where swirling mists acted as a heavy shroud for the ancient stone. A freezing gale roared through the pines, carrying the metallic bite of oncoming snow. Nature here was an indifferent god, vast and terrifying. The climb had been a brutal test of machine and spirit. Jack gripped the steering wheel of the black pickup truck so hard his knuckles turned white, his beige winter jacket rustling with every tense movement. The engine's rhythmic rattle, which had been a constant companion in the city, had transformed into a desperate, high-pitched scream as they ascended the final, narrow switchback of the mountain pass. Just as the jagged silhouette of a structure appeared through the swirling fog, a thick plume of acrid white smoke erupted from under the hood, obscuring the windshield with a blinding veil of steam. Jack cursed under his breath, his jaw tightening as he wrestled the heavy, unassisted steering toward a small, gravel-strewn turnout. The truck gave one final violent shudder, a mechanical death rattle, before the engine died with a clatter that echoed off the granite cliffs like a gunshot. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the rhythmic pinging of hot metal cooling in the biting mountain air. Buster sat bolt upright in the passenger seat, his ears pinned forward and his nostrils twitching with military precision. He didn't wait for a command. He sensed the sudden stillness was not a sign of peace, but the herald of a new, more dangerous struggle. Jack pushed the door open, his left leg screaming in protest as it hit the frozen ground. He reached back for his sturdy wooden cane, leaning heavily on it as he limped toward the front of the truck. The radiator had finally surrendered, hissing like a cornered viper. As he waved away the steam, he looked up and saw it, the Watchtower. It was less a house and more a fortress of timber and stone. clinging precariously to the edge of a massive granite precipice. But as his eyes traced the terrain, his heart sank into a cold void. The property was split in two by a terrifying geological scar known to the locals as Dead Man's Chasm. It was a deep, vertical abyss that seemed to drop into the very bowels of the earth, shrouded in a permanent, roiling mist that moved with a life of its own. On Jack's side of the chasm stood the main living quarters, a weathered two-story cabin that looked like it was being swallowed by the cliff. On the opposite side, separated by a 100-foot gap of empty air, sat the workshop, a sprawling, low-slung building made of reinforced concrete and dark steel where his father had spent his final, isolated years. The old suspension bridge that had once connected the two worlds was gone, its thick hemp rope severed and dangling uselessly against the cliff face like the broken, necrotic limbs of a giant. The wind howling through the gap didn't just whistle, it screamed with a metallic frequency, a sound that Jack's combat-trained ears recognized as the vibration of something unnatural. He was isolated, trapped on the threshold of his own inheritance by a bridge that had been torn down by something far stronger than a mere storm. A low, guttural rumble from a nearby cluster of ancient pines drew Jack's attention. A group of men stood near a beat-up logging truck, their eyes fixed on him with a cold, predatory curiosity that bordered on open hostility. Leading them was Elias Thorne, a man who looked like he had been carved out of the mountain's dark granite. Elias was in his early 60s, possessed of a massive frame encased in a stained, heavy leather vest that had seen decades of hard labor. His beard was a thick, unruly briar patch of gray and charcoal, and his hands were enormous, the skin stained permanently with coal dust and grease. A jagged white scar ran through his left eyebrow, pulling the skin up and giving him a perpetual expression of menace. Elias was a man of few words and hard, unforgiving judgments, his personality forged by the uncompromising laws of the mountain. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the pristine snow, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Jack's beige jacket and the military-style cut of his hair. To Elias and the others, Jack wasn't a veteran or a man seeking a home. He was the madman's son, a carrier of the same bloodline that had brought strange noises, flickering blue lights, and a lingering sense of dread to these peaks for 20 years. They didn't offer a hand or a word of welcome. They stood like sentinels of a closed world, their silence a clear warning that Jack was an outsider walking on the thinnest of ice. Beside Elias stood a woman whose presence offered a different, sharper kind of intensity. Clara Miller, the local postmistress and owner of the valley's only supply store, was a sharp-featured woman in her late 40s who seemed made of wire and wool. She was tall and spindly, her graying hair pulled back into a bun, so tight it seemed to stretch the pale, translucent skin over her high cheekbones, making her eyes appear unnervingly wide. Clara wore a thick, hand-knitted wool shawl and carried a permanent air of cautious, weary observation. Unlike the men, her eyes weren't filled with pure hate, but with a haunting sort of pity that made Jack feel even more like a ghost. She had seen the mad scientist waste away on that cliff, shouting at the wind and hauling strange, heavy crates across the bridge. She stepped forward slightly, her voice thin and vibrating like a taut wire, as she warned Jack that the bridge hadn't fallen by accident. She spoke of the wind in the chasm as if it were a sentient, hungry beast that tore down anything that didn't pay its toll in blood. She advised him to leave before the first true blizzard sealed the pass, her words a cold prophecy that chilled Jack more than the mountain gale ever could. The fear in her eyes wasn't for Jack, he realized. It was fear of what his father had left behind in that workshop across the abyss. Jack ignored the stares, his focus shifting back to Buster. The German shepherd had wandered toward the jagged edge of the chasm, his hackles raised in a sharp, defensive ridge along his spine that Jack hadn't seen since their final patrol together. Buster wasn't looking at the villagers. His amber eyes were fixed on the workshop side of the abyss, specifically the dark space beneath the building's foundation. He paced the edge of the cliff with a frantic energy, his nose pressed to the frozen ground, letting out a series of sharp, agitated wooфs that vibrated with genuine alarm. Jack limped over, his wooden cane clicking rhythmically against the stone, and knelt beside his companion, ignoring the protest of his shattered knee. On the very lip of the chasm, partially obscured by a fresh dusting of frost, were several strange indentations. They weren't the tracks of a wolf or a mountain lion. They were heavy, rhythmic scrapes in the rock, accompanied by a faint, oily residue that smelled of old ozone and salt. Buster growled deep in his throat, a sound of pure military suspicion. He sensed something moving in the shadows beneath the workshop, something that didn't breathe like a living creature, something that waited in the dark for the bridge to be rebuilt. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers across the chasm, the wind began to howl with a new, mournful frequency. It whistled through the empty window frames of the workshop and rattled the remains of the bridge cables against the cliff. Jack looked down into the swirling white mist of Dead Man's Chasm, realizing the sheer scale of the isolation he now faced. He was a man with a broken truck, a broken leg, and a broken bridge, standing on the edge of a legacy that seemed designed to destroy him. But as he looked at the workshop, the place where his father's secrets were locked away, a flicker of the old combat engineer's defiance sparked in his chest. He wasn't just here to survive, he was here to reclaim what was his. He reached out and placed a heavy hand on Buster's head, feeling the dog's muscles coiled like a high-tension spring. They weren't alone on this mountain, and whatever was lurking in the depths of the chasm was about to find out that Jack wasn't just a madman's son. He was a builder who knew exactly how to fortify his ground against the coming storm. First night at the Watchtower was not a homecoming. It was a brutal initiation into a realm of ice and absolute isolation. As the last sliver of violet light bled out of the sky, the temperature plunged with a violent, predatory speed that Jack hadn't experienced since his winters in the high mountains of the Hindu Kush. Within the main cabin, the air turned brittle, and every exhale became a thick, silver ghost in the beam of his flickering flashlight. Jack had attempted to ignite the central heating system, a complex, archaic beast of brass pipes and heavy iron valves, only to find it cold and unresponsive, its mechanical heart silenced by a lack of power. The main house was a tomb, its walls bleeding frost, and as the wind outside began to scream with the intensity of a jet turbine, Jack knew that staying in the cabin meant surrendering to hypothermia. The only source of heat, the industrial-grade generator that fed the entire property, was housed in the workshop on the opposite side of Dead Man's Chasm. Between him and survival lay 100 feet of lightless, howling abyss, and the twisted remains of a bridge that no longer existed. Jack sat on the floor of the lightless kitchen, his back against the frozen wood, massaging his shattered knee as the cold began to seep into his marrow. He looked at Buster, who was huddled near him, the dog's breath coming in short, visible puffs. Even the hardened K9 was shivering, his amber eyes fixed on Jack with a silent, urgent plea. The shame he had felt in the city returned, but this time it was sharpened by the primal instinct to survive. He was a combat engineer. He was a man who had rigged bypasses under sniper fire and laid cables across ravines. He would not let a mountain and a broken bridge be his end. Pushing himself up with a grunt of agony, Jack limped to his gear. He retrieved a heavy-duty climbing harness, a set of industrial carabiners, and a spool of high-tension paracord, relics of his service that he had never been able to throw away. Stepping out onto the porch was like walking into a wall of knives. The wind in the chasm had reached a fever pitch, a mournful, metallic wail that seemed to vibrate the very stone beneath his feet. Jack reached the anchor point of the old bridge, where a single thick steel cable still spanned the darkness, though it was slack and encrusted with ice. His plan was simple and terrifying. He would use a pulley system to slide across the cable to the workshop ledge. He ignored the dizzying drop beneath him, focusing only on the mechanical steps. He clipped himself in, his fingers nearly numb despite his heavy gloves, and felt the harness bite into his hips. Buster let out a sharp, panicked bark, pacing the edge of the cliff, his claws clicking frantically on the frozen granite. "Stay, Buster!" Jack commanded, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. With a final, bracing breath that burned his lungs, Jack pushed off the ledge. The world became a blur of freezing mist and the screech of metal on metal. The cable groaned under his weight, swaying violently in the crosswinds. Halfway across, a sudden, powerful gust slammed into him, spinning him like a top. The ice on the cable shattered, and for a terrifying second, the pulley jammed. Jack hung suspended over the black maw of the chasm, his injured leg dangling uselessly as the wind tried to tear him from the line. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in his chest. but he forced it down with the iron discipline of a soldier. He reached up, his muscles screaming, and began to pull himself hand over hand toward the workshop ledge. His progress was agonizingly slow, each inch bought with a surge of pain that radiated from his shoulder to his shattered knee. As he neared the opposite side, the rusted anchor bolt in the workshop's wall let out a sickening crack. The cable dropped several feet, jerking Jack downward. He swung violently toward the jagged cliff face, his fingers slipping from the icy line. He was falling, his stomach dropping into his throat until a sudden, powerful weight slammed into his upper body. Buster, who had navigated a narrow, treacherous animal path along the inner lip of the chasm in the dark, had lunged from a lower outcrop near the workshop entrance. The dog didn't bark. He simply bared his teeth and clamped his powerful jaws onto the heavy fabric of Jack's beige jacket, digging his paws into the frozen earth with desperate strength. The sheer power of the German Shepherd halted Jack's descent. For a heartbeat, they were frozen in a tug of war against gravity, the dog's muscles quivering with the effort of holding a grown man. Jack found a handhold, a protruding piece of rebar from the workshop's foundation, and hauled himself upward with a guttural roar. He rolled onto the narrow ledge, gasping for air, the metallic tang of blood in his throat. Buster collapsed beside him, his chest heaving, his muzzle coated in frost. Jack reached out and buried his hand in Buster's thick fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You saved me." The workshop loomed over them, a silent monolith of concrete and corrugated steel. Jack forced the heavy side door open and found the generator, a massive custom-built machine that looked more like an aircraft engine than a standard power source. Jack's engineering mind took over. He checked the fuel lines and cleared the frost. With a violent heave of the pull cord, the machine coughed and roared to life. The vibration hummed through the floor, and the overhead industrial lights flickered on, bathing the room in a harsh, cold glow. As heat began to radiate from the exhaust, Jack slumped against a workbench. However, Buster was not resting. The dog was prowling the back corner of the room, his nose to the floor. He stopped at a section of the floorboards near a heavy locked tool cabinet, a spot where the wood looked slightly lighter than the rest. Buster began to bark, a sharp, repetitive sound, and then he began to claw at the wood with frantic energy. Jack limped over, his curiosity overriding his fatigue. He used a crowbar to pry up the loose board Buster had identified. Hidden in a shallow, felt-lined compartment was a long, pressurized metal tube, sealed with a heavy wax stamp. Jack unscrewed the cap and pulled out a roll of thick, high-quality vellum. As he unrolled the sheets across the workbench, his eyes widened. These weren't the scribblings of a madman. They were masterfully executed technical blueprints. The title at the bottom read, "The Sky Corridor, Phase 1." It was a design for a revolutionary bridge, a sleek aerodynamic tunnel of reinforced glass and dark steel. Unlike the old suspension bridge, this structure was designed like an aircraft fuselage, built to let the wind flow around and through it, rather than resisting it. It was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering applied to architecture. Jack stared at the intricate calculations for tension, lift, and wind resistance. He realized that his father hadn't been mad in the way the villagers thought. He had been obsessed with a solution to the very isolation that was currently killing them. The blueprints were unfinished, with notes in the margins about local materials and the need for a builder's hand to complete the final welds. Looking at the sheer scale of the project, Jack felt a daunting weight, but also a spark of clarity. The Sky Corridor was the only way to permanently reconnect the house to the workshop and survive the coming blizzards. It was a bridge between his past as an engineer and the legacy his father had left behind. Jack looked at Buster, whose amber eyes were fixed on the drawings as if he understood their importance. The mission had changed. He wasn't just a squatter in a ruin anymore. He was the only man capable of building the impossible. The dawn broke over the granite peaks not with a roar, but with a cold, crystalline silence that seemed to sharpen the very air Jack breathed. The first light of the sun hit the frost-covered workshop, turning the industrial glass and rusted steel into a shimmering, temporary palace of ice. Jack stood on the edge of the abyss, his beige jacket zipped tight against the biting wind, his wooden cane planted firmly in the snow. In his hand, he held the pressurized tube containing his father's blueprints. The vellum now weighted with the responsibility of a final mission. For the first time since the IED had shattered his leg and his career, Jack didn't feel like a broken tool discarded by a heartless city. He felt like a combat engineer again, standing on the threshold of a tactical objective. The Sky Corridor was no longer just a madman's dream on paper. It was the only path to survival, and Jack intended to build it with the same iron discipline that had once seen him span rivers under the shadow of war. His first task was an inventory of despair and hope. He spent the morning limping through the workshop's cluttered corners, uncovering caches of high-grade aeronautical steel, reinforced glass panels, and heavy-duty industrial bolts that his father had spent decades hoarding. To supplement these, Jack began to strip his own pickup truck, salvaging the winch, the heavy-duty battery, and even the steel framing of the bed. Every cent of his meager military pension and the last of his savings were poured into a desperate order of welding rods and structural epoxy from Clara Miller's supply store down in the valley. When he arrived at the store to collect his supplies, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, judgmental silence. Standing at the counter was a new face, Silas Vance, the village's unofficial blacksmith and a contemporary of Jack's father. Silas was a man in his late 70s, his body as bent and gnarled as a mountain pine, with skin the color of cured leather and a thick scent of coal smoke perpetually clinging to his heavy wool apron. His left hand was missing the middle finger, a souvenir from a malfunctioning forge, and his eyes were a piercing, cynical gray that seemed to look right through Jack's beige jacket to the scars beneath. Silas was a man of cold iron and hard facts, a person who believed that the mountain eventually reclaimed everything humans tried to build upon it. He watched Jack load the heavy boxes of bolts with a slow, rhythmic shake of his head, his voice a low rasp like sandpaper on stone as he muttered to the gathered locals about another madman building a castle in the air. To Silas and the others, Jack's project was an affront to the mountain's power, a fool's errand that would only end with more broken glass at the bottom of Dead Man's Chasm. Ignoring the mockery, Jack returned to the Watchtower and established a brutal, military-grade routine. He woke at 05 OS every morning, the cold biting into his shattered knee, as he forced himself through a series of grueling physical therapy exercises before the sun even touched the peaks. Discipline was his shield against the crushing weight of isolation and the echoes of his past. The work was slow and agonizing. Every beam he moved felt like a mountain itself, and every weld had to be perfect to withstand the gale force winds that screamed through the chasm. Buster became his most vital asset, the German shepherd adapting to the construction site with a sharp, intuitive intelligence. Jack fashioned a heavy-duty harness for the dog, allowing Buster to act as a living winch, pulling tension lines across the abyss and dragging heavy scrap metal across the workshop floor. Buster's role wasn't just physical. He was the sentry of the peaks. More than once, his low, guttural growl alerted Jack to a mountain lion prowling the tree line, or a pack of hungry wolves circling the perimeter of the light. The dog's amber eyes were ever watchful, his presence a grounding force that kept Jack's mind focused when the shadows of the workshop seemed to whisper with his father's voice. As the weeks passed and the skeletal frame of the first box girder began to take shape over the lip of the chasm, the village's hostility began to evolve into a strange, distant curiosity. A few of the local children, led by Leo, the wiry teenager from the night of the storm, began to venture up the path to watch from a safe distance. Among them was Maya, a 10-year-old girl with a shock of messy blonde pigtails and bright, energetic eyes that refused to be dimmed by the harsh mountain life. Maya was a whirlwind of motion, her oversized wool hat constantly falling over her eyes as she hopped from rock to rock. She was brave in a way only a child can be, fascinated by the way Jack transformed piles of rusted junk into a structured, gleaming corridor. The children were terrified of Jack's stern, scarred visage, but they were utterly enchanted by Buster. During Jack's brief lunch breaks, the old K9 would soften his predatory gaze, allowing Maya and the others to approach and marvel at his intelligence. Maya would watch in awe as Buster fetched heavy wrenches on command or stood perfectly still as Jack measured the tension in a cable. To these children, Buster wasn't just a dog. He was a hero out of a legend, a loyal guardian helping a broken king build a bridge to the stars. Despite the small moments of warmth, the physical toll on Jack was immense. His beige jacket was now stained with oil and grease, and his face had grown lean and gaunt, his blue eyes sunken, but burning with a feverish intensity. He worked until his hands bled, and his breath came in ragged, frozen gasps. One afternoon, as he was struggling to align a massive steel plate while suspended over the chasm, Elias Thorne appeared on the high ridge above. The lumberman didn't speak. He simply stood there with his arms crossed over his massive chest, his silhouette a dark omen against the white peaks. He watched as Jack nearly slipped, his cane clattering against the metal, and his lip curled in a sneer of pure contempt. To Elias, this wasn't engineering. It was a desecration of the mountain's natural order. He shouted down a warning that the first gale of the solstice would tear Jack's glass corridor to shreds, leaving him with nothing but a faster way to fall into the abyss. Jack didn't look up. He didn't have the breath to waste on a man who built nothing but walls of silence. He focused his entire being on the sound of the welder's spark, the blinding blue-white light that cut through the mountain's gloom. He thought of his father's blueprints, of the aerodynamic curves designed to dance with the wind instead of fighting it. He realized that the villagers called his father a madman, not because his science was flawed, but because he dared to believe that a man could live with the mountain rather than just under its shadow. As the first section of the box girder was finally secured, jutting out over the dark maw of Dead Man's Chasm like a defiant steel tongue, Jack allowed himself a single moment of pride. He leaned his weight against the cold metal, his hand resting on Buster's head, and looked out across the gap toward the workshop. The bridge was barely a skeleton, a fragile thing of steel and hope. But it was a beginning. He had started the impossible, and as the children's laughter echoed faintly from the trees, Jack knew that he wasn't just building a corridor. He was building a bridge back to his own soul. The skeleton of the sky corridor jutted out over the mist of Dead Man's Chasm like a fractured bone, a testament to Jack's sheer will, but also a glaring admission of his limitations. For 3 days, the work had ground to a devastating halt. Jack stood on the frozen threshold of the workshop, his breath forming thick, ragged clouds as he stared at the blueprints spread across a scarred metal workbench. The math was cold and unforgiving. The recycled steel from his truck and the salvaged scrap were enough for the secondary framing, but the central span, the heart of the aerodynamic corridor that would have to endure the shearing force of the mountain gales, required heavy, industrial-grade I-beams that he simply did not have. Without them, the first true blizzard would buckle the glass and send his father's legacy screaming into the abyss. Jack ran a grease-stained hand over his buzz-cut hair, the silence of the workshop feeling heavier than the granite peaks above. He was a builder who had run out of stones, a soldier who had run out of ammunition. Beside him, Buster shifted his weight, his amber eyes tracking a movement on the lower switchback road. The German shepherd let out a low, vibrating growl, a sound of warning rather than aggression. Jack grabbed his cane and stepped out onto the snowy ledge, his beige jacket whipped by the rising wind. Emerging from the veil of mist was an ancient rusted flatbed truck, its engine groaning under a massive, heavy-topped load. It wasn't the light delivery vehicle from Clara's shop. This was a heavy hauler, and the man behind the wheel was someone Jack had only seen from a distance: Samuel Miller. Samuel was Clara's older brother, a man known throughout the valley as the Granite Wall. He was in his late 60s, a massive block-shaped man with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire cabin of the truck. His face was a map of deep weathered canyons, and his eyes were a piercing, icy gray that rarely blinked. Samuel was a man of legendary silence and a temper that had cooled over the years into a terrifying, immovable stubbornness. He dressed in heavy, grease-caked canvas overalls and a tattered wool cap, his hands so large and scarred, they looked like they had been used to break stones by hand. Samuel was the kind of man who viewed conversation as a luxury he couldn't afford, and his previous interactions with Jack had been limited to cold, disapproving stares. The truck lurched to a halt, the brakes screaming in the thin air. Samuel climbed down, his movements slow and deliberate, the ground seeming to vibrate under his heavy boots. He didn't look at Jack at first. Instead, he walked to the back of the flatbed and threw back a heavy tarpaulin. Beneath it lay 6 massive high-carbon steel I-beams, their surfaces gleaming with a protective industrial coating. Jack's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly what the sky corridor needed, the backbone of the impossible. "What is this, Miller?" Jack asked, his voice rough with suspicion and disbelief. "I didn't order this. I don't have the money for this." Samuel didn't answer immediately. He walked to the edge of the chasm, looking at the skeletal bridge, then back at Jack. His voice, when it finally came, was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from his boots. "I didn't ask for your money, soldier," Samuel said, his eyes finally meeting Jack's. "I'm here to pay a debt, not to you, to the man who used to scream at the clouds." Jack froze, his hand tightening on his cane. "My father?" Samuel nodded, his gaze drifting toward the high tree line of the northern ridge. He began to speak, the words coming out as if he were unearthing long-buried rocks. Years ago, long before Jack had returned, Samuel had been caught in a freak early-season whiteout while checking his timber lines. He had been pinned under a fallen cedar, his leg crushed, the cold beginning to shut down his heart. He had resigned himself to a frozen grave when a figure had emerged from the swirling snow. Jack's father, carrying a portable hydraulic jack and a thermos of hot soup. The madman had worked for 3 hours in a killing wind to free Samuel, then carried the massive man on his back for 2 miles through the drifts to a hidden emergency shelter. He had stayed with him all night, keeping him awake, talking about wind currents and aerodynamic lift to keep Samuel's mind from slipping into the dark. When the rescue party arrived the next morning, Jack's father had vanished back into the mist, refusing to take any credit or even mention the event to the village. "He told me that if I ever spoke of it, he'd stop selling me his precision-milled gears," Samuel said with a ghost of a grim smile. He was a man who preferred the company of his machines, because they didn't ask him why he was so lonely. He wasn't crazy, Jack. He was just quiet. Too quiet for people who need noise to feel alive. As Samuel began to help Jack unload the steel using the truck's crane, the image of the man Jack had hated for 20 years began to shift and dissolve. He had pictured his father as a selfish eccentric who had abandoned his family for toys and blueprints. But through Samuel's eyes, Jack saw a different man, a protector who operated in the shadows, a man whose madness was perhaps a fortress he had built to protect a heart that was too sensitive for the world. The blueprints of the sky corridor weren't just technical drawings. They were an olive branch extended across time. Every weld and every calculation his father had made was a silent conversation Jack was only now beginning to understand. His father hadn't been shouting at the wind because he was insane. He was trying to master it so it wouldn't kill the people he secretly cared for. The work resumed with a new, frantic energy. With Samuel's help and the superior strength of the new I-beams, the central span of the bridge began to bridge the gap with terrifying speed. Buster seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere, his tail wagging as he ran between the two men, his barks echoing off the canyon walls. The village children, Leo and Maya, appeared again, their eyes wide as they saw the granite wall working alongside the soldier. Samuel even allowed Maya to sit in the cab of his truck, a gesture of warmth that shocked the local girl into silence. The alliance was fragile, built on old debts and new steel, but it was the first crack in the wall of isolation that had defined the Watchtower for a generation. By the time the sun began to set, the main structural beams were anchored deep into the granite on both sides of the chasm. The sky corridor was no longer a skeleton, it was a bridge. Jack stood on the newly laid steel, the wind whistling through the girders, feeling the vibration of the structure beneath his boots. It felt solid. It felt right. Samuel Miller wiped his coal-stained hands on a rag and climbed back into his truck, nodding once to Jack. No words were needed. The debt was paid, and a new one had begun. As the truck's taillights disappeared into the mist, Jack looked down at Buster and then across the abyss to the workshop. For the first time, the madness of the project felt like sanity. He wasn't just building a bridge to the workshop. He was building a bridge back to a father he had never truly known. The gale of the solstice was coming, and for the first time, Jack felt ready to face it. The air at the Wind Watchtower had grown razor sharp, a harbinger of the celestial shift that signaled the coming of the great mountain winter. The heavy lifting was done, the massive I-beams anchored deep into the granite, forming a skeletal bridge that defied the laws of gravity and the villagers' expectations. Now began the most delicate and dangerous phase of the sky corridor, the installation of the reinforced glass panels. These were not ordinary panes. They were specialized, multi-layered sheets of aeronautical-grade polymer and glass, designed to flex under the immense pressure of the chasm's crosswinds. Each panel was heavy, slick, and unforgiving. Jack worked with a frantic precision, his beige jacket now a mosaic of grease and frozen sweat. He felt the weight of the deadline pressing against his chest like a physical stone. The first true blizzard was less than 48 hours away, and without the glass skin to complete the aerodynamic fuselage, the wind would turn the steel frame into a giant whistle, vibrating it until the anchors shattered. As the afternoon sun cast long, amber shadows across Dead Man's Chasm, Jack found himself balanced on a narrow steel catwalk 40 feet out over the abyss. He was attempting to seat the final corner panel of the lower section. His breathing was heavy, echoing inside his hood, and his hands, despite the thick work gloves, felt like wooden blocks. The pain in his left leg had been a constant low-level thrum for days, but as he shifted his weight to leverage the glass into its housing, the thrum turned into a sudden, blinding, white-hot explosion of agony. The old shrapnel scars and the damaged nerves from the IED blast finally revolted under the strain of the cold and the exertion. His knee didn't just hurt, it simply ceased to function. The joint buckled outward with a sickening pop that Jack felt more than heard. He lost his center of gravity instantly. The world tilted, the horizon of the mountains spinning upward as he tumbled over the edge of the steel beam. Gravity took him with a terrifying, silent rush. The safety harness he had rigged from the truck's winch cable snapped taut with a violent, bone-jarring jolt, halting his fall just 10 feet below the catwalk. He slammed into the vertical support beam with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs, leaving him gasping for air in the freezing void. He hung there, suspended over the black, misty depths of the chasm, spinning slowly like a macabre ornament. Every movement sent fresh waves of nausea-inducing pain through his shattered leg. He reached for the cable, but his fingers were too numb to find purchase on the slick, frosted steel. He looked up at the skeletal bridge above him, feeling a wave of familiar, bitter despair. He was a soldier, trapped in a no-man's land of his own making, dangling between a past he couldn't escape and a future that seemed determined to kill him. On the ledge of the workshop, Buster had witnessed the fall. The German shepherd didn't panic with aimless pacing. His training took over. He stood at the very edge of the cliff, his amber eyes locked onto Jack's dangling form. He knew his master couldn't hear a whimper over the screaming wind, so he reached into the depths of his K-9 training, memories of search and rescue drills in the desert heat flickering in his mind. Buster planted his paws and let out a series of barks that were distinct and rhythmic. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. It was the SOS signal, delivered with the lung-bursting power of a dog whose entire world was hanging by a thread. The sound didn't just drift. It cut through the gale, echoing off the canyon walls and carrying down the valley like a rhythmic clarion call. Down at the lower trailhead, Leo was with a friend, Gabe, who had recently returned from the city. Gabe was 17, a contrast to Leo's wiry frame. He was a broad-shouldered youth with a mop of messy auburn hair and a persistent, energetic grin that seemed at odds with the mountain's gloom. Gabe wore a faded high school varsity jacket over a heavy hoodie, his movements athletic and slightly clumsy. A boy transitioning into a man's strength, but not yet possessing a man's caution. Gabe was the son of a logger, a boy who had grown up climbing trees and wrestling machinery, and unlike the older villagers, he harbored a secret admiration for the soldier building a bridge over the abyss. When Buster's rhythmic barking reached their ears, Leo froze, his eyes widening. "That's the dog," Leo whispered. "Something's wrong." Gabe didn't hesitate. He dropped the wood he was hauling and began to run toward the Watchtower path. "That's not just barking, Leo," Gabe shouted over his shoulder. "That's a distress call. Move!" By the time the two boys reached the edge of the chasm, Jack was slipping into a dangerous cold-induced lethargy. His vision was blurring, and the pain in his leg had faded into a terrifying numbness. He heard the sound of gravel shifting and the frantic scratching of Buster's claws. Then, he heard a new voice, Gabe's voice, loud and commanding. "We see you, Jack! Just hold on! Don't let go!" Jack looked up through half-closed eyes and saw the two boys leaning over the edge. Behind them, a few other local youths had appeared, drawn by the urgency of Buster's call. For a moment, the old soldier and Jack wanted to tell them to leave, to bark a command that he didn't need help. But then he looked at Buster, whose muzzle was pressed against the rock, his eyes filled with a desperate human-like terror. For the first time in his life, Jack realized that his iron discipline was just another wall he had built to keep people out. He let out a breath he had been holding for 20 years. "The winch," Jack croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Use the manual crank on the truck. Slow." Gabe and Leo scrambled to the truck, their movements a frantic but coordinated blur. They found the winch mechanism Jack had salvaged from his pickup. Gabe used his broad shoulders to provide the leverage, while Leo guided the cable. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to haul Jack up. The other boys joined in, grabbing the cable with their bare hands, their faces turning red with the effort against the mountain wind. They pulled as one, a singular force of human will working against the gravity of the chasm. When Jack finally cleared the edge of the catwalk, Gabe and Leo reached out, grabbing his beige jacket and hauling him onto the solid steel. Jack collapsed onto the metal, his chest heaving, his body shaking uncontrollably. Buster was on him instantly, whining and licking Jack's face, his tail thumping against the beams in a frantic rhythm of relief. Jack lay there, surrounded by the youths of the village he had viewed as enemies. He looked at Gabe, who was panting, his hands raw from the cable, and then at Leo, who was watching him with a quiet, fierce pride. The wall of hostility hadn't just cracked, it had dissolved. "Thank you," Jack said, the words feeling heavy and strange in his mouth. Gabe wiped his forehead and offered a crooked grin. "Don't mention it, Jack, but you're a mess. You can't finish this alone before the snow hits." Jack looked at the remaining glass panels, then at his shattered knee. He knew Gabe was right. He couldn't do it alone. He looked at the boys, their young faces eager and expectant. "Can you boys handle a screwdriver without breaking it?" Jack asked, a faint, rare glimmer of a smile touching his lips. The next 12 hours were a blur of coordinated chaos. Under Jack's barked directions, the youths became an impromptu construction crew. Gabe and the stronger boys handled the heavy lifting of the glass, while Leo and the smaller children handed up bolts and sealed the seams with epoxy. They worked with a newfound energy, the Madman's Bridge becoming a community project. Even Maya appeared, bringing thermoses of hot broth from Clara's shop, the village women having sent a silent offering of support. As the final panel was seated into the roof and the last seal was tightened, the first few flakes of snow began to drift down from the darkening sky, large, heavy petals of white that signaled the start of the solstice storm. They had finished. The sky corridor was sealed, a gleaming, transparent tube of steel and glass that stood as a defiant shield against the mountain's breath. Jack stood in the center of the bridge, Buster sitting proudly at his side, as the snow began to blanket the world in white. He wasn't just safe, he was no longer alone. The bridge had done its job before a single person had even walked across it. The sky collapsed into a blinding white vortex, erasing the peaks and the valley. A ferocious, bone-shattering wind screamed through the trees, burying the Watchtower under drifts of dry, crystalline snow. Inside the mountain's throat, the world turned into a frozen, soundless void, where only the strongest spirits could survive. The storm arrived with a savage, primordial roar that made the granite foundations of the Watchtower tremble. It was not merely a winter squall, it was the gale of the century, a historical atmospheric event that the elders of the valley would speak of for decades. Down in the village, the power grid had surrendered within the first hour, the heavy lines snapping like brittle threads under the weight of ice and the relentless shearing force of the wind. The roads were no longer paths but treacherous white rivers of impassable drifts, isolating every house into a lonely island of shadow. But high above, perched on the edge of Dead Man's Chasm, the Watchtower glowed like a defiant ember in the heart of a frozen furnace. Inside the main cabin, the fireplace crackled with a steady orange warmth, but the true miracle was the sky corridor. The aerodynamic design Jack's father had envisioned worked with terrifying efficiency. Instead of resisting the 100-mile-per-hour gusts, the bridge seemed to slice through them, the wind's energy channeled around the reinforced glass fuselage with a low, harmonic hum that sounded like a distant choir. Jack walked through the corridor, his boots clicking softly on the dark steel floor. He no longer needed his cane as much inside this space. The level ground and the warmth radiating from the workshop's industrial heaters made his shattered knee feel more like a dull ache than a jagged spear. Beside him, Buster paced with a calm, predatory grace, his amber eyes reflecting the soft blue LED lights Jack had installed along the handrails. The interior of the bridge was a sanctuary of civilization, suspended over an abyss of chaos. Through the thick, multi-layered glass, Jack watched the snow whip past in horizontal streaks, the chasm below a roiling cauldron of white mist. He felt a profound, almost alien sense of peace. For years, his life had been defined by the noise of battle or the suffocating silence of a city that didn't want him. Now, in the midst of the worst storm in history, he felt a strange, ironclad security. He had built this. He had finished his father's work, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a part of himself that the desert sands had tried to bury. He stopped at the center of the span, leaning his weight against the glass. The sky corridor felt solid, a testament to the heavy I-beams Samuel Miller had provided, and the hands of the local youths who had helped him seal the roof. He reached down and ran a hand over Buster's head, feeling the dog's steady, rhythmic breathing. "We made it, buddy," Jack whispered, his voice lost in the hum of the bridge. "We're finally above the storm." He looked toward the workshop, where the lights were bright and the air was filled with the scent of ozone and heated metal, then back toward the cozy, fire-lit cabin. The bridge wasn't just a path. It was a transition between his two worlds. He was no longer a man trapped on one side of a chasm. He was the master of the bridge that crossed it. But as he turned to continue toward the workshop to check the generator's fuel levels, a sudden, sharp movement across the abyss caught his eye. Across Dead Man's Chasm, on the opposite mountain ridge where the old logging road curved toward a permanent dead end, a jagged flicker of light cut through the whiteout. It was faint, a staccato pulse of blue and white that didn't belong to the natural world. Jack squinted, his combat-trained eyes scanning the darkness. Then came the sound, a long, desperate wail of a vehicle's horn, thin and distorted by the wind, but unmistakably a cry for help. A vehicle was trapped on the high pass, a place that should have been empty since the first snows fell. Jack watched as several beams of high-powered flashlights danced frantically against the wall of snow. Whoever was out there was in deep trouble. They were on a road that led nowhere, blocked by drifts that would be 10 feet high by morning. If they stayed in that car, they would be frozen statues before dawn. Inside that trapped vehicle sat Dr. Elena Vance, the daughter of the cynical blacksmith Silas Vance. Elena was 34, a woman whose beauty was defined by a sharp intellectual ferocity rather than softness. She had short, dark hair that she kept tucked behind her ears and eyes the color of flint. Gray, hard, and capable of sparking under pressure, she was a trauma surgeon in the city, a woman who spent her days navigating the bloody geography of human injury, which had left her with a weary, pragmatic temperament. She had been driving through the storm in a desperate attempt to reach her father after hearing of the madman's son and the tensions in the village, fearing the old man's heart wouldn't survive the stress or the cold. Beside her was Marcus, a young, broad-shouldered EMT with a nervous habit of tapping his fingers on the dashboard. Marcus was in his early 20s, possessing a kind, round face that was currently pale with terror. He was strong, but he lacked the mountain-bred stoicism of the people of the valley. Their SUV had been shoved off the main path by a massive snowslide, and they were now perched precariously on a ledge of the dead-end road, the engine dead and the heater rapidly losing its battle against the mountain's breath. Elena gripped her flashlight, her knuckles white. She was a woman of science and logic, and the logic here was simple. They were dying. She looked at Marcus, whose breath was coming in ragged, panicked gasps, and then out at the white void. "We can't stay here, Marcus," she said, her voice a sharp blade of command. "If we stay, we freeze. We have to move toward the lights on the cliff." She had seen the glowing ribbon of the sky corridor through the gaps in the storm, a phantom structure that seemed to float in the air. To Marcus, it looked like a hallucination, but to Elena, it was a lighthouse. She forced the door open against the weight of a drift, the freezing wind instantly stripping the heat from her body. They began to crawl through the waist-deep snow, a desperate slow-motion struggle for every inch of ground. Back on the bridge, Jack felt the old adrenaline of a rescue mission surge through his veins, overriding the calm of the sanctuary. He didn't think about his leg. He didn't think about the danger. He saw the flashlights getting weaker, the movements of the figures across the chasm becoming more sluggish. They were succumbing to the sleep of the cold. He turned to Buster, whose ears were pinned back, his amber eyes fixed on the distant lights. "Buster, we've got a problem," Jack said, his voice dropping into the low, tactical tone of a squad leader. He ran to the workshop, grabbing a coil of rope, and a powerful industrial searchlight. He returned to the center of the sky corridor and aimed the beam across the abyss, cutting a path of brilliant white light through the falling snow. The light hit the two figures, illuminating them like actors on a stage of ice. Jack saw the woman, Elena, dragging the larger man through the drifts. She looked up, her face a mask of frost and determination. And for a second, their eyes met across the 100-foot gap of Dead Man's Chasm. Jack realized then that the sky corridor wasn't just a bridge between his cabin and his workshop. It was a bridge between the Watchtower and the world. His father hadn't built a fortress to hide in. He had built a platform to see from. Jack slammed his fist against the emergency release of one of the glass panels, a feature he had added for ventilation, but which now became a rescue hatch. The wind roared into the corridor, instantly dropping the temperature, but Jack didn't flinch. He began to rig the winch, his hands moving with a practiced mechanical speed. The madman's legacy was about to face its first real test, and Jack was ready to prove that the bridge could hold more than just secrets. It could hold the weight of a life. The howling of the gale of the century had reached a pitch that transcended mere sound, becoming a physical vibration that rattled the very marrow of Jack's bones. Inside the reinforced glass and steel cocoon of the sky corridor, the world was a frantic monochromatic blur of white and gray, but the structure itself held firm, humming with the aerodynamic efficiency of a high-altitude aircraft. Jack's industrial searchlight had already cut a path through the gloom, but as he adjusted the beam, his heart underwent a cold, sickening squeeze that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The blue and white flickers he had seen earlier weren't just from a lone SUV. Trapped behind Dr. Elena Vance's vehicle was the familiar, boxy silhouette of the valley's small school bus, its yellow paint barely visible under a rapidly accumulating shroud of snow. The bus was canted at a terrifying angle, its rear wheels spinning uselessly over the crumbling edge of the dead-end road, held back from the abyss only by a thick cluster of frozen pines and the grace of a dying engine. Through the frosted windows of the bus, Jack could see the pale, terrified faces of children, their small hands pressed against the glass like captive birds. Jack didn't hesitate. The old soldier's instinct for casualty mitigation overrode the throbbing agony in his shattered knee. He limped back to the workshop's control panel, his hands moving with a mechanical, frantic certainty. He bypassed the standard power limiters on the generator, shunting the full load of the massive aeronautical engine's output into the sky corridor's lighting array. With a heavy thud of a circuit breaker, the bridge transformed. Hundreds of high-intensity LED strips, embedded along the steel ribs of the corridor, flared to life simultaneously. The sky corridor became a radiant, glowing rib of brilliant white light that sliced through the heart of the storm like a holy sword. It was no longer just a bridge, it was a beacon of civilization, a luminous tunnel that stood as a defiant middle finger to the darkness of the mountain. The light reflected off the swirling snow, creating a shimmering, ethereal path that pointed directly to the safety of the Watchtower. Standing at the front of the bus, struggling to keep a group of 6 traumatized children calm, was Sarah Jennings. Sarah was 29, the valley's only elementary teacher, and a woman whose delicate appearance belied a core made of tempered steel. She was slender, with auburn hair that had escaped its messy braid to frame a face splattered with freckles and reddened by the biting cold. Her eyes were a deep, observant hazel, usually filled with a playful warmth, but now they were hard with the desperate clarity of a protector. Sarah had moved to the mountains from the city 3 years ago, seeking a life of quiet meaning. But today she had become a captain of a sinking ship. She was wearing a bright yellow parka that matched the bus, her gloved hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer effort of holding the bus door shut against the gale. Beside her, Dr. Elena Vance had managed to reach the bus from her stranded SUV, her medical bag clutched to her chest. The two women shared a look of grim understanding. The bus was sliding, the pines were snapping, and time had run out. "Sarah, look!" Elena shouted over the roar of the wind, pointing across the chasm. Through the whiteout, the sky corridor had appeared like a heavenly apparition. It was a bridge made of light, stretching out from the cliff face where only a void had existed an hour before. Jack emerged from the rescue hatch of the bridge, a dark, rugged silhouette against the blinding brilliance. He looked like a titan from an old myth, his beige jacket whipped by the wind, his wooden cane discarded in favor of a heavy rescue tether. Beside him, Buster stood like a guardian lion, his fur matted with ice, but his stance unshakable. Jack aimed a high-powered flare gun toward the road and fired. A brilliant crimson spark arced through the storm, landing just feet from the bus door, signaling his location and his intent. Jack and Buster stepped out of the safety of the corridor and onto the treacherous snow-choked ledge. Every step was a battle against a wind that wanted to toss them into the mouth of Dead Man's Chasm. Jack used a heavy iron crowbar to anchor himself into the frozen earth, creating a temporary guideline. Buster moved with an uncanny, predatory intelligence, finding the solid ground beneath the drifts and barking a sharp, rhythmic command for the survivors to follow. Elena was the first to emerge from the bus, helping the panicked EMT, Marcus, who was carrying the youngest child. Sarah followed, her arms wrapped around two more children, her face a mask of fierce determination. The walk toward the glowing mouth of the bridge was a journey through a frozen hell. The wind tried to strip the children from their feet, but Buster was there, leaning his heavy body against them, acting as a living shield against the gusts. Jack stood at the midpoint of the rescue line, his powerful arms reaching out to haul each person toward the hatch. When he grabbed Sarah's hand, the heat from his grip felt like a brand. Her hazel eyes met his blue ones, and in that moment, the madman's sun vanished, replaced by the only man who could save them. One by one, they were pulled into the warm, pressurized sanctuary of the sky corridor. The transition was jarring, from a world of screaming white death to a space of soft light, humming air, and the smell of ozone. The children collapsed onto the dark steel floor, sobbing and gasping as the warmth began to sting their frozen cheeks. Marcus, the EMT, immediately began checking for frostbite, his hands shaking as he worked. Elena and Sarah stood at the hatch, watching as Jack and Buster prepared to bring in the last of the group. The bus gave a final, sickening groan. A massive gust, a true solstice hammer, slammed into the mountainside. The pines that had been holding the bus finally surrendered with a sound like splintering bone. The yellow vehicle slid backward, its headlights flickering one last time before it vanished into the white abyss of the chasm. The sound of its impact at the bottom was swallowed by the storm, but the silence it left behind in the corridor was heavy with the realization of how close they had come to the end. Jack hauled himself inside and slammed the rescue hatch shut, sealing the mountain out. He stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, his beige jacket covered in a thick layer of rime. He looked at the group of 10 people, children, a teacher, a doctor, and a medic, all huddled in the center of his father's mad invention. Buster sat at the head of the group, his tail giving a single weary thump against the floor. The bridge held. It didn't just hold, it thrived. The aerodynamic shape diverted the wind so perfectly that the children couldn't even feel the vibration of the storm that had just tried to kill them. Sarah walked over to Jack, her auburn hair damp with melted snow, and placed a hand on his arm. She didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at the man the village had mocked and then out at the magnificent glowing corridor he had built. "You're the engineer," she finally whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're the one who built the light." Jack didn't know how to respond to the softness in her voice. He merely nodded and pointed toward the Watchtower. "The house is warm," he said, his voice a low, raspy rumble. "We have food, and the generator will hold. Let's get the kids inside." He led the procession across the bridge, the children marveling at the view of the storm through the glass walls, feeling as though they were walking through a dream. As they entered the main cabin, where the fire Jack had stoked earlier was still roaring in the hearth, the Watchtower truly became what it was meant to be, a fortress of life. The madman's legacy had passed its ultimate test. It wasn't a castle in the air, it was a bridge to the future. As Jack closed the heavy timber door of the cabin, shutting out the gale of the century, he looked at Buster and felt a sense of peace that no metal or city job had ever provided. He was no longer just a survivor, he was a protector. The interior of the Wind Watchtower's main cabin had been transformed from a cold, silent tomb into a chaotic, steam-filled sanctuary of survival. The roar of the solstice gale was reduced to a distant, frustrated thrumming against the thick timber walls, while the central hearth threw long, dancing shadows across the weary faces of the survivors. Sarah Jennings moved among the children with a quiet, tireless grace, her auburn hair now dry but wild, her hazel eyes reflecting the amber glow of the fire as she distributed bowls of thick, steaming broth Jack had prepared from his emergency rations. Dr. Elena Vance sat near the light, her surgical kit open as she tended to the minor scrapes and frostnip of the group, her flint gray eyes softened by the relief of being behind solid walls. In the corner, huddled near the heat, sat the man who had been leading the ill-fated rescue convoy before the bus was pinned, Sheriff Thomas "Tom" Reed. The sheriff was a man in his early 50s, possessed of a square, formidable jaw and skin that looked like it had been cured in the mountain sun, until it resembled cracked mud. He had a thick salt and pepper mustache that partially hid a mouth usually set in a grim, authoritative line, though tonight, that line was crooked with exhaustion. Tom Reed was a man of the earth, a former high school linebacker who had traded his jersey for a badge 30 years ago, known for a temperament that was as steady as a tectonic plate and a deep-seated suspicion of anything he couldn't see, touch, or arrest. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat that smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, and as he watched Jack limp across the room, his gaze was a complex mixture of professional scrutiny and profound, unspoken gratitude. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, son," the sheriff rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the soft murmurs of the children. He stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling, and gestured toward the glowing glass ribbon of the sky corridor visible through the window. "This isn't just a bridge. People in town, including me, thought your old man was building a monument to his own shadow. But that thing out there, it saved every soul in this room." Jack didn't answer immediately. He looked down at Buster, who was sitting at the edge of the kitchen, his ears pinned back and his amber eyes fixed on a specific spot on the floorboards, the same spot where he had been scratching frantically during the first night in the workshop. The memory of the secret compartment in the workshop flashed through Jack's mind, and he realized the madman's legacy wasn't finished giving up its ghosts. Without a word, Jack grabbed a heavy iron pry bar and led the sheriff toward the back of the cabin, near the stairs leading to the cold storage. Buster let out a sharp, urgent bark and trotted ahead, his tail held low and stiff, leading them to a section of the basement floor that was covered by a heavy, tattered rug. When Jack threw back the rug and used the pry bar to heave up the hidden trapdoor, the air that rose from the darkness wasn't the damp, earthy scent of a cellar. It smelled of ozone, dry paper, and the humming warmth of active electronics. As they descended the narrow stone steps, Jack clicked on his industrial searchlight, and the beam revealed a sight that froze the sheriff in his tracks. This was no basement. It was a subterranean command center, a sprawling meteorological and radio monitoring station that looked like it belonged in a high-security government facility rather than a mountain cabin. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with hand-drawn weather charts, topographical maps of the valley marked with precise, color-coded wind currents, and hundreds of black and white photographs of the peaks. In the center of the room was a massive array of vacuum tube radios, flickering monitors, and a series of complex barometers that were currently pulsing with the data from the storm above. A low, rhythmic clicking filled the room as a mechanical plotter drew a jagged line across a roll of graph paper, a real-time reading of the pressure differential inside the sky corridor. The sheriff walked to a long desk cluttered with leather-bound logs, his rough hands trembling as he opened one. "Good God!" Reed whispered, his eyes scanning the entries. He began to read aloud, his voice thick with a sudden, staggering realization. The logs weren't the ramblings of a lunatic. They were a meticulous 30-year record of the valley's life. There were entries about the Great Flood of '98, noting the exact hour Jack's father had sent an anonymous radio burst to the city to trigger the dam release that saved the lower farms. There were logs of diverted flights during winter whiteouts and early warnings of forest fires that had allowed the village to evacuate before the smoke even reached the ridgeline. The madman hadn't been screaming at the wind. He had been listening to it, translating its deadly language into a silent, anonymous shield for the very people who called him a freak. The sky corridor itself was revealed in the blueprints on the wall to be a massive structural sensor, a giant anemometer that provided the precise data needed to predict the centennial gales. It was designed as a high-altitude rescue hub, a central point where the geography of the mountain could be mastered to save lives during disasters exactly like the one currently raging outside. Jack stood in the center of the room, his searchlight reflecting off the glass of a framed photograph on the desk. It was a picture of him as a boy, sitting on his father's shoulders, both of them grinning in front of a half-finished wind turbine. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a final, handwritten note, the ink fresh compared to the logs. "For Jack," it read in the shaky script he now knew so well, "a bridge is never just for the man who builds it. I couldn't be the father you deserved, but I could make sure you had a place to be the man you were meant to be. The wind is coming, my son. Be the anchor." The words hit Jack with the force of a physical blow, more powerful than any IED. The 20 years of bitterness, the white-hot resentment for the father who had abandoned him for toys and blueprints, began to dissolve into a stinging, overwhelming wave of grief and clarity. His father hadn't left him. He had been preparing a battlefield where Jack's specific scarred skills would be the only thing that mattered. He had built a legacy of silent protection, a life of profound sacrifice that Jack had mistaken for madness because he was too blinded by his own pain to see the light. A ragged, choked sob escaped Jack's throat, and he slumped against the metal racks of the radio array, his head in his hands. The iron discipline of the soldier finally shattered, replaced by the raw, agonizing release of a son who had finally come home. Buster moved to his side, resting his heavy head on Jack's knee, letting out a soft, mourning whimper that echoed through the subterranean chamber. The sheriff stood silent, his hand resting heavily on Jack's shoulder, his own eyes moist as he looked at the thousands of pages of saved lives. Above them, the sky corridor hummed with the force of the storm, its aerodynamic frame singing a song of survival that Jack finally understood. His father hadn't been a madman. He had been a guardian, a silent watcher in the dark. Jack wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his beige jacket, the grease and the ash smearing his face, but his gaze was clear. The Oan Han was gone, replaced by a fierce, driving purpose. He looked up at the monitors, then at the sheriff. "The storm isn't over," Jack said, his voice no longer a raspy rumble but a clear, commanding strike. "And we have more people to find." He reached for the radio headset, his fingers moving with a new, ancestral certainty. He was no longer just a Kubin Kong Bin. He was the heir to the Watchtower, and the bridge was only the beginning. The storm broke not with a whimper, but with a magnificent crystalline silence that felt heavier than the roar of the wind. By 4 a.m, the gale of the century had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed into a pristine, white cathedral. When the first light of dawn finally touched the granite peaks, the sky bled into a deep, impossible indigo, before erupting into a kaleidoscope of gold and pale rose. Jack stood on the timber porch of the main cabin, his beige winter jacket unzipped to the crisp, freezing air, his lungs drawing in a breath so cold it tasted like silver. Beside him, the sky corridor was no longer a glowing ghost in the dark. In the full light of day, it was a masterpiece of human ingenuity, a transparent ribbon of reinforced glass and dark steel that caught the sun's rays and scattered them across the chasm like a fallen star. For the first time in his life, Jack didn't look at his hands and see only the grease of the workshop or the phantom blood of the battlefield. He saw the hands of a builder who had bridged the gap between a bitter past and a hopeful future. The silence was soon broken by the distant, rhythmic thrum of heavy engines. Below, on the winding mountain pass, a caravan of snowplows and rugged Force 4 vehicles crawled toward the Watchtower, their headlights pale against the brilliant morning. These were the parents and the people of the valley, coming for their children with hearts full of a terror that was about to be replaced by awe. As the vehicles reached the clearing, the villagers spilled out, their boots crunching on the fresh, waist-deep powder. Among them was Silas Vance, the blacksmith, his gnarled frame moving with a frantic speed that Jack hadn't thought possible for a man of his age. When Silas saw his daughter, Dr. Elena Vance, standing safely on the porch alongside Sheriff Reed, the old man's cynical gray eyes filled with a sudden, overwhelming moisture. He didn't speak. He simply pulled Elena into a crushing embrace, his heavy wool coat smelling of coal smoke and relief. As the families reunited with the children who had been saved by the madman's bridge, a profound shift occurred in the atmosphere of the Watchtower. Parents who had spent years mocking the strange noises from the cliff now stood in stunned silence, their gazes traveling up the magnificent length of the sky corridor. They saw the aerodynamic curves, the precision of the welds, and the sheer bravery of a structure that hung over the abyss to keep their children safe. One father, a man named Benjamin Ben Thorne, Elias's younger brother and a carpenter by trade, walked over to Jack. Ben was a man in his late 30s with a gentle sunburnt face and hands that were perpetually covered in fine sawdust. He was shorter than Elias, but possessed a quiet strength and a reputation for being the most honest man in the valley. Ben looked at the bridge and then at Jack, extending a hand that was warm and steady. "I'm sorry we didn't see the man you were," Ben whispered, his hazel eyes reflecting the gleaming glass. "We saw a ghost, but you were building a lighthouse." Among the crowd was a new face, little Oliver Vance, Elena's 7-year-old son who had been staying with Silas while she worked in the city. Oliver was a miniature version of the Vance family, with a mop of unruly dark curls and large, inquisitive gray eyes that seemed to take in the entire world at once. He was dressed in a miniature hunting jacket that was far too large for him, his hands encased in bright red mittens. Oliver didn't run to his mother immediately. Instead, he walked toward Buster, who was sitting regally at the center of the clearing. The boy stopped a few feet away, his head tilted in curiosity before slowly extending a red-mittened hand. For a second, the old soldier in Jack expected Buster to remain on guard, to maintain the predatory distance of a war dog. But Buster simply looked at the boy, let out a soft, welcoming huff, and rested his heavy head in Oliver's lap. It was the final sign that the war was truly over. One by one, the families departed, their vehicles disappearing back down the mountain pass, carrying with them the stories of the night the madman's son saved the town. Eventually, only Sarah Jennings remained. The school teacher stood at the railing of the sky corridor, her auburn hair catching the morning sun, her hazel eyes fixed on the distant snowy horizon. She looked exhausted, her face pale and her freckles stark against her skin. But there was a new, soft radiance about her. Jack limped toward her, his wooden cane clicking rhythmically on the steel floor of the bridge. He expected her to say goodbye, to head back to the village and the life she had been building. Instead, she turned to him, and the look in her eyes stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just admiration. It was a profound, soul-deep tenderness. "I was running away from the city because I thought the world was too broken to fix," Sarah said, her voice a soft, steady hum that seemed to resonate with the vibration of the bridge. "I thought that if you suffered enough, you eventually just became a shadow. But you took your scars and you built something that the wind couldn't break." She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to brush a stray piece of ash from the sleeve of his beige jacket. Her touch was light, but it felt like a bolt of electricity to Jack, a warmth that bypassed his defenses and reached the lonely, scarred heart he had hidden for so long. Jack looked at her, seeing for the first time not just a teacher he had rescued, but a kindred spirit, a woman who had also walked through a storm and was looking for a place to stand. "I think the Watchtower could use more than one person to listen to the wind," Jack said, his voice a low, raspy rumble that carried a rare, vulnerable hope. Sarah smiled, a slow, beautiful expression that lit up her hazel eyes. "I think you might be right, Jack." In the weeks that followed, the story of the Wind Watchtower became a legend in the valley. Sheriff Tom Reed made sure the truth of Jack's father was known, and the madman was posthumously recognized as the town's silent guardian. But the most significant change happened for Buster. The town council, led by a reformed Silas Vance, officially bestowed upon Buster the title of the valley's first certified therapy dog. The German Shepherd, who had spent his youth in the heat of combat and his maturity guarding a lonely cliff, began a new chapter of his life. He was no longer required to scan the tree line for predators or pace the edge of the abyss. Instead, his days were spent in the village school, surrounded by children who vied for the chance to pet his thick tan and black fur and tell him their secrets. Buster thrived in the warmth of the community, his amber eyes losing their predatory edge and filling with a calm, contented peace. He had earned his retirement, and as he sat in the sun on the porch of the Watchtower, watching Jack and Sarah work together on the next phase of the aerodynamic corridor, the old dog finally let out a long, satisfied sigh and closed his eyes. Jack stood at the center of the sky corridor, the glass walls protecting him from the mountain's breath. He looked down at the blueprints of a new project, a series of wind-powered medical clinics he and Sarah were planning for the remote parts of the valley. He was no longer a man with a broken leg and a broken spirit. He was a man with a purpose, a partner, and a legacy that was only just beginning. The sunrise at the Watchtower wasn't just the end of a storm, it was the birth of a new era. As the golden light filled the corridor, turning the world into a vision of glass and hope, Jack realized that his father had been right all along. A bridge isn't just a structure, it's a choice to connect, to protect, and to love. And for the first time in 48 years, Jack knew exactly where he belonged. The journey of Jack and Buster at the Watchtower is not merely a story of constructing a bridge of steel and glass. It is a powerful testament to the strength of perseverance and the beauty of selflessness. From a forgotten veteran, Jack used the scars of his past to create a corridor of light, connecting hearts and saving his community in the midst of a fierce storm. This story reminds us that no pain is ever in vain if we use it to shelter others. Life is full of miracles, and sometimes those miracles do not come from afar, but bloom from our own hands and efforts when guided by God through the most difficult trials. God does not only give us the strength to overcome storms, but also entrusts each of us with a mission to be a lighthouse for those around us. Believe that after every freezing blizzard, a radiant sunrise always awaits those who dare to choose building bridges instead of walls. If this story has touched your heart and given you motivation, please help spread this light by liking, sharing this video, and leaving a comment with your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next inspiring journeys. Let us join together in prayer so that love and tolerance will always be present in every home and every community. May God bless you and your family with peace, grace, and strength on every path of life. Thank you for listening and joining us.